What's with this feud that you seem to have with Jon Stewart?
Well, I think that's just like I identify it as just, a petty kind of, fully fueled by insecurity. And
Who's insecurity?
Mine.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, John never did anything to me. I was just jealous.
Marc Maron's recent Esquire interview feels like both a confession and a reflection on where comedy stands today. He talks openly about his long-running jealousy of Jon Stewart, describing their feud as petty and driven by his own insecurity rather than anything Stewart did. Beneath that honesty, though, is a deeper story about aging in comedy, dealing with success, and how envy can shape how comedians see one another. Maron's admission supports what Joe Rogan once said, that Maron resents other comedians who become more successful than him.
It's also, he's pathologically jealous. Like, he's like literally mentally ill. Like, do you understand? Mark, when he first started, when he was just first coming up, was friends with Mitch Hedberg, and then Mitch Hedberg hit, and he couldn't be friends with him anymore.
Really?
Yep. Stop being his friend. Same thing with Louis C.K. Louis C.K. and him were tight. Louis blew up, Mark didn't. He had to fucking hate him, and it turned on him.
He doesn't mention Rogan directly, but his comments make it clear that he has often struggled with feelings of being left behind. When he compares himself to Stewart, he paints a picture of a man who always seemed to have his life together, disciplined, well-managed, and able to use his talent strategically. Maron, by contrast, describes himself as messy, reactive, and too emotionally invested in needing validation from others. The result was years of tension with Stewart that existed mostly in his own head.
Yeah, I talked about this recently, probably not smart. And of course it makes clickbait. And it's the same day that John's like doing something noble, of course, standing up for Colbert. And then this other clickbait is like, Maron still hates John. I'm like, oh my God, fucking timing on that. So just jealous. Because when I was coming up, he was a smart, cute Jewish guy, who was good at, some people have foresight and are disciplined careerists. And they know how to understand their talent, harness it, and then figure out how to capitalize on it, with their skill set on their terms. And, there are guys now that have that. Like, I went to a birthday party for John Mulaney, and I'm just surrounded by all these young guns who are, talking about, their lawyers and, and what they need from them. I'm like, I didn't even have a fucking lawyer. I never had any control over my talent. I never knew its limitations or what it was. I was just, all in and just like demanding, a place in the world of comedy.
When Maron finally tried to reconcile, Stewart brushed him off politely but coolly, showing how deep the rift had become. This moment of honesty ties into a bigger pattern in Maron's career, his constant battle between integrity and ambition. He often says that he never got into comedy to be a celebrity or entertainer, but to speak his mind. He views comedy as a place for truth-telling and vulnerability, not for chasing fame or clicks. This puts him at odds with what he calls the Rogan sphere, a world of comedians and podcasters who use controversy, provocation, and anti-woke posturing to build audiences. Maron believes that kind of approach cheapens comedy and turns it into a political tool rather than an art form.
How much do you have to give trans people? What is your big problem with gay people? What's your big problem with women? It's like, what is this, the fucking 80s again?
I don't know that the comedians have had that much power.
Are you out of your mind?
No, I'm being serious.
Joe Rogan. I'm not gonna.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
You can't separate. Like, if the movement is like, we're being censored. No, you're not. You're not. There's no constitutional censorship issue with your free speech. You say things, and in a democratic show of an environment, like Twitter or whatever, there's cultural pushback. And I'm not saying that it wasn't. It was pretty bad in terms of people getting canceled and stuff, and I agree that was an issue, but that's a specific issue. To frame it as some sort of free speech problem was a misdirect.
The interview also hints at a wider cultural shift. Maron suggests that after movements like Me Too, a lot of men retreated from the conversation, leaving space for louder and more extreme voices online. In his view, this gave rise to what some call the manosphere, a loose community of men reacting angrily to social change. Maron criticizes this trend, saying it's not real strength, but fear disguised as rebellion.
So in Panicked, you talk about the manosphere, which is this sort of actually, you define the manosphere for us.
Well, I think the manosphere, I think it's a collective, a tribal collective of mostly men who felt threatened, by the way culture was going. They felt, kind of pushed aside, that they didn't have a voice.
Yeah.
And now you have them as a dominant, voice within the culture,
Yeah.
because I think they were turned out by right-wing, propaganda.
I want to pay you a compliment on that front, though, because I feel like the manosphere, one of the things that it grew out of, Me Too movement explodes into view. Very necessary, right? But there's a moment where a lot of well-meaning progressive men kind of receded and said, you know what, we don't need to talk right now. And it was very well-intentioned, but at the same time, you had a whole kind of generation of young men that are like, wait a second, how do we navigate this space? And there were no good voices necessarily to guide them through that. So all of these, kind of grifters and bad actors kind of stepped in there. Mm-hmm. You, on the other hand, though, you were there, you know what I mean? And you were continuing to, I think, be a voice for that kind of positive masculinity.
True. I think men in general were afraid. And I think younger men, didn't know how to navigate, interpersonal relationships with women. And once you start normalizing this language, just because you're upset, you can't say retard anymore.
Yeah.
However they defend it, but I'm not using it like that. It's just a word. But once you normalize that word again, the damage that it has on an interpersonal level or on a smaller level with kids in school, with mentally challenged people, with families of mentally challenged people, that once that word just becomes normalized after they spent all these years looking for the respect so they could have them or their child fit into the world without shame, is gone.
He argues that not using certain words isn't about being controlled, but about respect. For Maron, personal growth comes from being willing to listen and change, not from doubling down just to prove a point.
Yeah.
Look, I've taken my hits and I've learned my lessons from, they're hard-learned things, if you're an asshole.
Yeah.
And to sort of get vulnerable and, understand why you're an asshole, as opposed to double down on being an asshole, is a choice.
What makes this interview powerful isn't just the gossip about Stewart or Rogan. It's how Maron uses those conflicts to explore his own insecurities and what they say about comedy as a whole. He admits to envy, to being overly defensive, and to sometimes sabotaging himself. But he also defends comedy as a craft that should challenge people and demand self-awareness, not just chase attention. In the end, Maron's reflections make him seem less like a bitter veteran and more like someone trying to grow up publicly. His honesty may prove Rogan right about his jealousy, but it also shows why Maron remains one of the few comics willing to expose his flaws without hiding behind irony or outrage.